What's up with these guys? Thorn Sorcerers. You see them all over the place in the game. There are two prominent camps in Liurnia where you see them with fire monks. They don't wield a lot of fire incantations, though. They use blood sorceries, which is very strange. The description of them, or at least of this sorcery that they use, Briars of Punishment, says an aberrant sorcery discovered by exiled criminals. Theirs are the sorceries most reviled by the Academy. Wounds the caster with thorns of punishment, sending a trail of blood thorns running over the ground to impale enemies from below. This sorcery can be cast repeatedly. The guilty, their eyes gouged by thorns, lived in eternal darkness. There they discovered the Blood Star. So there's some sort of alliance between these guilty, exiled, criminal sorcerers and the fire monks. You can see they have this sort of crown of thorns around their head, very reminiscent of the story of the crucifixion of Jesus, right? The crown of thorns that was placed on his head. They use these branches to cast sorceries. Not like a glintstone staff like you would see over at like Raya Lucaria or anything like that. So they're using a type of sorcery that is not approved of by the Academy, that's seen as heretical, sort of going against the grain of established practice and orthodoxy. There's some really interesting real-world inspiration behind these guys, so we're going to talk about it. But first, I want to read you a quote. This is from a man named Robert of Avesbury in the 14th century. He said, in that same year of 1349, about Michaelmas, which is like late September, it's an old Christian holiday, over 600 men came to London from Flanders, mostly of Zealand and Holland origin. Sometimes at St. Paul's and sometimes at other points in the city, they made 2 daily public appearances wearing clothes from the thighs to the ankles, but otherwise stripped bare. Each had in his right hand a scourge with 3 tails. Each tail had a knot, and through the middle of it there were sometimes sharp nails fixed. They marched naked in a file behind the other, and whipped themselves with these scourges on their naked and bleeding bodies. So what the heck is going on? Who are these guys? What does this have to do with Elden Ring? These men that Robert here is describing in the 14th century are called flagellants. These are people who devoted themselves to a very particular and somewhat disturbing religious practice during the worst pandemic that humankind has ever seen. So to understand flagellants and to understand the influence that this historical practice had on Elden Ring and some of the enemies and visual design of that game, we have to understand the Black Death. Also known as the Great Mortality, also simply known as the Plague. Right? Most people in that time, in the latter half of the 14th century, just referred to it as the Plague. This was the single most fatal pandemic in human history, with estimates on deaths ranging from 75 million people on the continent of Europe all the way to 200 million people. At that higher range of the estimate, that means that over half of the people who lived in Europe died in the span of less than 10 years. I think the worst of the plague was only about 6 or 7 years, but it killed almost 200 million people. It had an 80% mortality rate. So if you got the plague, it was basically over for you. And you would know pretty soon if you got the plague. You would see the signs, black fingernails, like pustules on your body, high fever. It could kill you in as little as a day. There's contemporary accounts from the time of people writing about their experiences seeing people die of the plague. Right? You wake up in the morning, you feel fine, you go to work, and by lunchtime you're in the ground, you're 6 feet under. This thing killed quick, it was nasty, it was extremely infectious, and add on top of that the fact that people didn't know about germ theory back then. They didn't actually know how diseases spread. And they weren't stupid, right? They had all sorts of theories, and they were actively trying to find out how diseases spread and how they could prevent people from getting diseases. Probably the most popular theory back then was called miasma theory, which is basically just like it's kind of almost like airborne transmission. They were close to it. They thought it had to do with air quality. Not that it was transmitted from person to person, but literally like the air around you became sick. So people would leave, when they saw the plague coming to a city, when they saw people dying, they would leave and try and get to a place that had better air, quote unquote. So they weren't that far off, and that was actually pretty effective. Leaving a big city, going to some remote location, that could usually protect you from the plague, but not always, right? People could carry this with them, infect others. The sheer fact of so much death in such a condensed period of time really reshaped European society. It reshaped class relations. It reshaped labor relations, right? If 200 million people die, all of a sudden there are a whole lot fewer people to work the fields and shoe the horses and, make the food. So now the price or the value of their labor is much higher because it's a lot more scarce. It's just basic supply and demand. So the Black Death actually put some people, peasants, workers, farmers, in a bit of a bargaining position with the landowners and the noble class. In medieval society, you had basically 3 estates or 3 classes. Historians break it down into the people who fight, the people who pray, and the people who work. So you had knights. These were people who were noble or people who owned land. They had an obligation to these other classes to protect them and to fight in wars to keep them safe. You had the church, who oversaw the spiritual health of the community. They were there to guide people through life, to intercede between them and God. And then you had everybody else who were making all of the stuff that society needs to exist. Farmers, laborers, artisans, people like that. All of these 3 classes owed obligations to each other. And the way that people thought about it at that time was that, hey, if we all owe each other something, that's a good way to build our society. Everybody has these mutual obligations to each other to sort of keep the peace and to keep things going. But this was kind of the beginning of the end of the Middle Ages. After the Black Death, into the 15th and 16th centuries, we start to see kind of the beginnings of the early modern period. The rise of finance and financial tools and instruments kind of replacing this former noble class. The rise of independent bankers and merchants coming into all of this power all of the sudden, almost supplanting the noble class that used to be above them. Because, hey, what does it matter what my family name is if I've got a ton of money and I'm buying and selling and trading stuff all over the world? We don't necessarily need this old system anymore. So over the next 2 centuries, because of the Black Death and because of a bunch of other things, you kind of saw the end of the Middle Ages. Flagellants, they appeared before the Black Death, but they really sort of came into prominence during the plague and during this huge pandemic. These are men, usually men, I think some women were involved too, but usually groups of men who would travel to town, and they would whip themselves with these instruments. Now, why on earth would somebody do that? What's the point of that? It's kind of twofold. And just a note in this photo here, these are not Klansmen. This outfit is a very old, traditional, like Catholic outfit. You see it in Spain, especially a lot. In Europe, people wearing these hoods and white robes. This was later appropriated by the clan in America in the 19th and 20th centuries. But this is kind of an older costume that people would wear sometimes. So what's the purpose of being a flagellant? Part of it was to share in what people called the Passion of the Christ. And that doesn't mean like Jesus had big feelings about something. The Passion is how people refer to the final days of Jesus's life as it's depicted in the Gospels. So from his entry into Jerusalem on a donkey all the way up to his death and resurrection. That's referred to as the Passion. For medieval Christians, identifying with the suffering of Jesus and sharing in the passion of Christ was important to them. They thought that they could become close to God if they experienced suffering that was similar to what Jesus experienced. And they were also trying to do something called mortification of the flesh. That basically just means denying yourself. So people did this sometimes through fasting, through the practice of like Lent, right? The 6-week period leading up to Easter, where people give things up to experience some sort of deprivation or loss. And it can extend all the way up to things like practices that we might now describe as self-harm, although the motivations are different. These people are not necessarily trying to punish themselves, and they're not even necessarily trying to like atone for their sins. That was part of it during the Black Death, during the plague. These flagellants thought that by this big public display of religious devotion and religious fervor, they could gain God's favor again. God would, turn his face to them and push the plague away and save people from this disaster that was happening. But yeah, it wasn't necessarily like these guys thought, I'm such a bad person, I need to be punished for my individual sins. They were identifying with Christ's sacrifice, right? In these stories, Jesus is punished and Jesus suffers so the rest of us don't have to. Jesus, drinks the cup of God's wrath. There's a million different ways that people describe this. Flagellants were doing sort of the same thing. Right? I am going to suffer, I am going to be punished on behalf of these other people to try and turn away this disaster and turn away God's wrath. This practice still continues to this day in certain places. I don't really have a whole lot of specifics, but I know that there are some Catholic Christians in certain parts of Southeast Asia who actually have people nail them to crosses, like nails through their palms. Needless to say, don't try that at home, right? That's a very dangerous thing to do. But we still have modern examples of this religious fervor and of people trying to, share in the sufferings of Christ. So that's who the flagellants were. It's pretty obvious that From Software was at least drawing a little bit from this historical practice when they invented these blood sorceries, these Thorn Sorcerers. But this is just such a weird category in this game too, because these sorceries and these Thorn Sorcerers kind of stand at a nexus of a bunch of different things in the game. So they are related to the fire giants, but they're also related to blood and something called the Blood Star, which may or may not be the formless mother that Moog found. Thorns are also associated with death blight. When your character dies or when another tarnished or human character in the game gets death blighted, you see these roots and briars and thorns kind of erupt out of them. You can get items in Stormvale that have thorns on them, and their descriptions suggest that maybe thorns have something to do with grafting, but there's also an image of there's an image in the basement of Stormvale of Godfrey, of the first Elden Lord, who's currently his body is alive but his soul is dead. So maybe they're kind of related to Deathblight and Godfrey and whatever's going on with him. But it's also related to Glintstone and Rhea Lucaria and spells and sorceries in general. Because you can get this item called the Staff of the Guilty. This is the, the glintstone staff, quote unquote, that these Thorn Sorcerers are using. And one thing that I never noticed before, but that I saw when I was doing some research for this, was that these staffs literally turn the blood of sacrifices into glintstone. So they serve as this kind of alchemical, transformational thing whereby people take blood and they turn it into glintstone. And glintstone is what people use to cast sorceries. Glintstone, I believe, is from the night sky, right? It's pieces of stars. It's pieces of something that is up there that was wandering around in the night sky, and people can use it for magic. But apparently, there's also a way to turn blood into glintstone. That has to do with hexes, which is where we get to Rykard and Albric and all these other people, right? These little red stones on Albric's robe are blood that was turned into glintstones, and he uses these thorn sorceries. Albric went to Mount Gelmir. He discovered these ancient hexes, which hexes were a category of sorcery in Dark Souls 2. They don't technically exist in Elden Ring. There's nothing called like hexes. These magma shots are just they're just magma sorceries. But there's some kind of other type of magic that exists in this world that has to do with blood and fire and thorns and death and darkness and Jesus. So that's where we're at. Not a whole lot of answers, but definitely a very kind of interesting historical reference from software with these thorns, these punishments. There's also this the Shield of the Guilty. Apparently, these thorn sorcerers, or these people who are just the guilty, venerate this maiden who died and then was reborn in the lands between. And as far as I know, this is the only reference to her, but it's still kind of interesting, right? Who is this person? Why is she important to these sorcerers? Why did these sorcerers follow the fire monks all the way down from the mountaintop of the giants? What do they have to do with Rykard? I don't have all the answers, but I just thought it was kind of interesting.